In the Historic American Buildings Survey and Historic American Engineering Record, we call HABs, HAIR. These are basically documenting. A lot of this stuff was done in the 30s as part of the Depression to give work to out-of-work artists or architects or engineers, and they would go out and basically document historic homes or bridges or aqueducts or some other type of work, dams, things like that. And it's still being done today. You can still actually be a part of the program with the National Park Service and go out and do these site sketches of the buildings, detailed drawings. Okay, moving on. Let me get to snuff here. So talking a little bit about the resources that were available to someone who's interested in looking into the history of their community. Let's sort of apply it to Nelsonville. And I'll sort of go over briefly the history and the architecture of the community, basically from 1814 to about 1950. So this covers the gamut. It covers settlement all the way to post-coal industry. So following the overview of Nelsonville, we'll go outside and we have a little exercise so you can kind of look at the buildings for yourself and see if you can see some of the details that we talk about here. So basically, the canal, the early settlement, we'll talk about three phases. So early settlement, canal era, we'll talk about the railroad and the coal boom, and then the post-coal boom, sort of leading up to how the community looks today. Oops. So Nelsonville was founded in 1814 on a 200-acre tract purchased from the Ohio Company by Daniel Nelson and his wife. They plotted out Nelsonville between 1818 and 1820. There were about 57 lots to begin with. There were only 2 streets. So Nelsonville's grown quite a bit since then. In 1820, they added some more lots. But it was still a fairly small town. There wasn't a whole lot of anything here. It really was just beginning. So you couldn't tell what was to come with the coal boom. By 1830, a Nelsonville resident named James Knight hauled the first 2 wagon loads of coal to Columbus to be sold at market. And this sort of woke people up that there were these resources, because all around here you've got the former coal mines. There's these hills that were just chock full of it. Chock full of coal, and that's just such a valuable resource. But there was no way to get it from Nelsonville to Columbus. No easy way anyway. So the members in Nelsonville petitioned to get a branch of the canal to come to Nelsonville, because at that time that was the best way to do it. So by, 1843, the canal stretched from Columbus all the way to Athens. And so the growth of the coal industry just from that time on blossomed. So just a short 10 years after the canal was opened, over 50,000 tons of coal were being shipped from Nelsonville to Columbus. So to give you an idea of the population growth at this time, this is coming from those census records. In 1850, there were approximately 300 to 400 people living in Nelsonville, which nearly doubled by 1860. And then by 1870, it was over 1,000. So even before the railroad came, you could see a growth in the community. This talks a little bit about settlement patterns in Ohio. Basically, I just want to point out that this is how Ohio was parceled out. All of these were surveyed into this. You can see this grid pattern here. So it was a systematic survey that people could come and buy land, specific sizes of land. They could buy a tract of land. They could buy a whole section for 640 acres. So, but different companies own different areas of land. This area that we're located in now was actually originally owned by the Ohio Company. And this is Athens County right there. So you can see just sort of how the beginnings were before anyone was even here. They had to survey and know what we had to give. So, moving on. So by 1866, Nelsonville had about 137 houses in it. So we're getting there, but not quite the boom that was to come. But pictured here is a typical house type of this period. It's called an I house. And it's called an I house because modern geographers discovered this house type mostly in I-named states like Illinois and Indiana. And basically you can tell an I house because it's got this sort of rectangular plan. It's only 1 room deep. It's got a central hall. And usually the centrally located entrance is flanked by 1 or 2 bays of windows. So this is pretty common for this time period, and these are the types of houses that you would see from this time period. There's not a whole lot from before the railroad era in Nelsonville now. So this is over on East Washington Street. But there are some Italianate influences, which is an architectural style. You can see in the tall, narrow windows. And if the picture were bigger, you could see these are sort of decorative hood molds over the windows. Things to note for later. Other styles that were emerging were coming about because of pattern books that were being published. And pattern books could be widely distributed because the U.S. was becoming more industrialized. So railroads were able to carry this information to the community at large. And this is actually a picture from a pattern book. And you can see the similarity between what was considered this American ideal of a house. And it had its own lot. It was sort of landscaped. While this lot doesn't seem to be as big nowadays, you can see the similarity between these two. And you can see elements of this picturesque sort of Italianate style. We've got brackets, these tall, narrow windows. There's sort of a square plan to this house. So this is getting closer. This is actually the Eugene Cable House. The Cable name is associated with a hardware store that was in town. And there was also a mayor in 1838 that was Cable. So it's sort of a prominent family that's associated with this house. So here are some commercial interpretations of this same picturesque sort of Italianate style. This is a nice example of a boomtown front. So when buildings are going up, it's also part of that Italianate feel to it. It's making the building seem bigger than it is, so the town's more developed than maybe it actually was. A lot of times you'll associate this with Western towns, but the trend was no different here. They went up, they tried to get them up fast. This is actually one of the oldest buildings. Portions of it, but part of it was built in 1838, and then it was expanded again in 1878. So you can see there's a nice detail here of those paired brackets. There's some detailed hood molds here. And this sort of still has that rectilinear plan, but it's got a hipped roof, which is also another hallmark of the style. So moving on quickly here to the railroad era and the coal boom. And they go hand in hand. So once the railroad came to town, coal exploded, basically. The coal industry became the number one industry in Nelsonville. It was coal, and coal was it. And as a result, a lot of the population grew in Nelsonville, and a lot of the built environment that we have that we're able to see nowadays is reflected in this area, in this era, because this is when a lot of buildings were being built. This is when the community was prosperous. So by train, it took less than 7 hours to get from Nelsonville to Columbus. The canal trip would take over 2 weeks. So you can see how fast, much more efficient the railroad was. It could haul a lot more as well. But as a side note, by car it takes like an hour and 20 minutes nowadays. So we've come quite a long way. So by, let's see, by 1872, there was roughly over 250,000 tons of coal being shipped between Nelsonville and Columbus. So this increase also brought about new mines. So at the peak of its period, of the railroad period, there were about 200 coal mines serving this area, which is it can be contrasted pretty well with just 38 during the canal era. So, and Nelsonville, in this whole Hocking Hills region, was actually the first town to become a city because its population was growing so fast.